Thank you so much for the invitation to speak, and thank you to PCT for putting on this wonderful virtual conference about rodent control. So today I'm going to talk about what we see from a municipal standpoint as it pertains to rodent control programs. So there's a lot of cooperation in our city between our program and the pest management professionals. And I think, there are things that we all can learn from each other. So when doing rodent control, it's important to understand your city. And in the case of New Orleans, it's a really old city, founded in 1718. So we straddle the Mississippi River, and we're really surrounded by water. So there's Lake Pontchartrain, and of course we've got lots of marsh and the rivers. And so we're pretty low in elevation, and in fact, many places below sea level. And we're, I would say, relatively small. It's about 350 square miles in total, all of Orleans Parish. And there's about 169 square miles of land. Our population last year was estimated to be at about 384,000 people, with a mean income of $45,615. So you have to really understand the basic components of your city so that you have a better idea of where challenges could be. So our organization has been around for a long time, since 1964. It actually started out with mosquitoes only, and over the years we've adopted rodent control from the New Orleans Health Department, and we've added general pest, really following an IPM procedures, and we do lots of work with termites. So as I mentioned, commensal rodents, all three, the house mouse, the Norway rat, and the roof rat is what we see in Orleans Parish. And so even in some locations, we will have both species. And sometimes we even find all three. So we do know that these animals are sharing resources in close proximity. I do want to touch on the status of municipal rodent control programs in the U.S. There was a great paper that came out this year. I placed the reference at the bottom so you can read it for more information. But the programs will vary in size and in scope. And in fact, a large majority of municipalities do not have a rodent control program, which should be a concern for everyone. There should really be cooperation between our pest management professionals and our city agencies. Well, look, funding is tough. Hopefully, you'll live in a city that at least has the ability for the public to call 311 and request at least an inspection or service. Funding levels are really going to vary if there is even a program. There are lots of cities that actually have contractors, which is going to be the private industry, our pest management professionals. So I really encourage all of you to contact your city officials and see what's in place. And if not, provide some opportunities and get to know let them know what capabilities you have. The program specifications are really going to vary. Okay, so I'm always on the side of writing tight, detailed specifications so you know what you're actually getting. Outreach programs as well, they're going to vary quite a bit. And this is everything that was found in this particular paper, as well as there was a white paper from NACCHO, and you can access that as well. But all in all, look, the status is not good, all right? And so we need to do better about trying to fund our municipal programs. So you may have Norway rats, you may have roof rats, your house mouse, whatever is in your particular area. But what is going to make a rodent a good agent, right, to transmit disease? We think about perhaps often many of these animals as a nuisance, but I assure you they have pathogens and the potential for disease spread is there. Well, there's a lot of diversity across the world, right? Not so many, when we're really talking about the US of rodents of importance, but they're very opportunistic and they do have high reproductive potential. So you can get high numbers in a relatively short period of time. That's going to cause high population densities and really those paradomestic affinities. So they're in and around our properties and where we live. So there's the potential for a lot of contact and exposure. When doing rodent control, it's important to understand the mechanisms of disease transmission, right? So if that Norway rat is outside in the sewer, moves through some broken pipes into maybe a structural opening into a restaurant, and then goes behind the bar, for example, where there are lots of glasses and cups. And so potentially has already then contaminated those items, and perhaps someone goes to our restaurant and, goes home, is not feeling well, it's just food poisoning. Well, is it food poisoning, or is it because you have been eating off of something that's contaminated with a rodent-borne pathogen? So that's kind of how I think about it. So let's look at the different ways of transmission. One, of course, direct contact with a rodent. And so that's coming into contact with saliva, blood, urine, feces, other body fluids. That's touching or scratching animals. Through indirect contact, right? Coming in contact in areas where the animals lived and roamed. So that can be an attic, it can be in an apartment, it can be in a kitchen, anywhere that's contaminated. It can also be vector-borne, right? Disease transmission. So this can be bitten by a tick or a flea, for example, or even a mite that might be on that rodent. And of course, also foodborne. I gave you an example, but it would be drinking something or eating something unsafe that's been contaminated, let's say with feces from an infected animal. So rodents check the box on all these different transmission routes. So it's really important to understand that you can really have some serious outcomes. I often think about rodent control in sort of the big picture, right? What are the different issues that are causing additional problems? And so here are some examples. For example, here, the sylvatic frontier and land encroachment, right? So it's that where those woods are, and we keep encroaching on different territory and expanding. Population growth of cities, and in a lot of these examples, it may be in a city in the U.S., but also internationally. What about urbanization, right? So population density is important when it comes to rodent control, people living close together. Lack of infrastructure or even aging infrastructure. And that's one of the things we deal with in New Orleans, is that aging infrastructure. A few years ago, Bourbon Street was repaired, and basically all of Bourbon Street, including the sidewalks, were excavated and redone. So for rodent control, that was one of the best things that happened, because it really fixed all that aging infrastructure, all that gunk and whatever else was in there sustaining those populations. So that was a good thing overall for rodent control. So increased poverty, poor levels of hygiene, that's a big issue, right? So think about homeless encampments, really a big problem. Access to healthcare services in some places, resistance to pesticides. We don't see that as much, and I don't think we have a true picture of what's going on here in the U.S. Not enough expertise or training in the area of vector control. So I see rodents as a vector, right? They can transmit disease. Lack of public participation, right? Is it your customers or is it my customers, the general public? It's not okay just to throw some crawfish out in a public park in an open garbage can or even next to that bench. So that causes lots of issues. Construction doesn't typically account for all these pest issues, okay? I think that's one of the urban myths we have. And of course, we are always thinking about climate change and increasing temperature, right? So I live in a place with roof rats. And so as the temperature increases, the potential for roof rat expanding the territory will do the same. Living in New Orleans, we're going to have natural disasters as well as man-made disasters. So my brain is always thinking about, preparedness and homeland security, and what are the steps that we need to do in order to keep our public safe. And so let's say a big event comes. In this particular case, it's a hurricane. You are going to have pests of immediate concern, mosquitoes, flies. Rodents come, but later in the process. Wildlife and stray animals also appear. So the goal here is to have everything in place, at least as much as you can, in order to have good preparedness. so that you're able to do the work if and when rodent populations really become altered and then food becomes available, for example, with a lack of trash pickup, and populations begin to increase. So again, I'm thinking about it from a big city standpoint, right? Almost 390,000 people, but you can look at it from your customer standpoint as well. It could be a hotel, it can be a restaurant, it can be even a subdivision if you have most of the accounts in there. So first and foremost, you really have to understand what species are in your service area, right? So you can do that all different ways. You may even want to do that with game cameras or trap a few, see what you have. For us, it's really important, as well as others, to have well-informed and funded municipal or state rodent programs. We all need to be advocates on this call, right? To say, hey, look, rodent control is important. Please fund it. We need a program. So also a method for the public to report sightings or infestations. For you, it would be your customers letting you know when they're having sightings, and for us, it's through a 311 system. How about routine surveillance or periodic surveys? Wow, that could be rodent populations. It can also be the ectoparasites and disease. That's a tough one. There isn't really, I think, a good true surveillance program around. People do all kinds of parts and pieces of it, but to do a comprehensive one is, I don't believe it exists. And so interagency cooperation and for information sharing, this is critical to be prepared and be able to respond. And look, that's going to be the PMPs talking with us and us talking with them. So in rodent control, we often are working in silos. Understand your infrastructure. All right, for me, it's, we have like 66,000 storm drains. But what you're looking at is your property, what's around it, so that you have good understanding of where a repopulation of these rodents could be coming from. For us, understanding private industry capacity, right? So if something big happens, I'm going to call on all of you to help me. We're just a few people. We're going to need to have more capacity. Make sure you understand your tools. Right, so in some places you've got carbon dioxide that you can use. Of course, we've got rodenticides. Some of the non-active baits are often really great. Monitoring traps, and then also pest proofing capacity. What do you carry with you? Do you just close the hole when you're there? Public awareness, again, we need to improve that. And I think you can work on your customers as well. And we need participation of the public, which would be your customer. So I think these are some of the basically areas, right, that we would need to have in place in order to have really great rodent preparedness. So typically after a disaster, you're going to have some time, right? So I'm talking more in the case of a flood, or unfortunately, there were those terrible tornadoes that ripped through our country, Kentucky and Illinois, and that were really destroyed those properties. And so those areas for rodents are going to be destroyed as well. And it's going to take a little bit of time, about 6 to 10 months or so after a big disaster, for them to recover, get the food sources they need, get back into reproduction, and have those populations grow. I do want to let you know that there is public assistance for through FEMA for rodent control. It really falls under eligibility for vector control. So it's both mosquitoes and rodent abatement. So if you are in a city and you are prone to disasters and that city doesn't have a rodent control program, I would absolutely start to get to know your local officials, health department, wherever you think is the right place, and possibly start throwing out the ideas of having some contingency contracts in place in the event of a disaster. When we work in rodent control across the city, we're always going to take an integrated pest management approach. Of course, we do inspections and we're starting a true surveillance system, but there's been a lot of work done looking at pathogens in our region. Sanitation is key. It is difficult, but it is absolutely key. Exclusion, population reduction, of course, through trapping and rodenticides. And we do work on public education, and that's of our general public, our businesses, our industry, and our public agencies as well. So that includes decision makers along with all other agencies. So one of the things we use is 311, and that was implemented in 2013 at the City of New Orleans. So we've always kept track of the folks that have called, and it starts here in 2006 because we lost all of our records prior to that during Hurricane Katrina. And the way we can use this data, and this is just an example from 2017, is we actually have the city divided up by block, and we're able to inspect these complaints, and we'll also get the information that comes from it, but we also can get the number of calls, or at least reports, right, of people that are having rodent activity at their yards or have seen rodents. All of our requests are serviced between 1.5, 2 days to 3 days max, and those are business days. And so it really gives us a good idea of what is happening at the residential level. It's important for us to look at history to see how many of these rodent-borne diseases threatened and caused human illness. And so what we don't want to do is repeat the same mistakes and have outbreaks occur now. So this is an example from New Orleans and the presence of murine typhus. You can read the publication at the bottom by Mr. Werkheiser. He was an employee of the City of New Orleans Health Department. So murine typhus was present both in the rat as well as in human cases. Human outbreaks did occur. There was a decrease in the 1950s, and for a period of time, there were no human cases from 1959 to 1970. They did find a low percentage of Rickettsia typhi in the rats, but no human cases. Well, let's fast forward a little bit, and in the 1971, the City of New Orleans was again threatened by murine typhus. There was an absence of 11 years without human population, but there was a big concern at the time. The rodent populations increased, associated with lots of workers along that riverfront. So, around in the area around the Mississippi River, had a lot of docks, a lot of workers, food sources, everything was there. And at the time, they were doing surveillance, right, of those rodents, and what they found was there was a big increase in Rickettsia in the rodent populations collected. So by 1971, with the resurgence of murine typhus in the rat population, the concern was, are we going to have a human population that's going to be affected by this disease? And so at the time, there was a restriction in the use of DDT. That's what they used to use for flea control, and also just abundant food at those docks. So the Mississippi River is and was even then a very active location, and a lot of imports and exports. And so it probably was a lot of available food, and they were seeing an avoidance of rodenticides. And without the human cases, funding was limited. And so that is always an issue of concern in public health and vector control. It's very important to always maintain surveillance. And so for them, it was a time of action. What they did was they took about a quarter of a mile of that dock. They were using malathion dust to kill ectoparasites. And what they ended up doing is reducing the overall flea population to about 3 fleas per rat. They were also observing 100 rats per hour. We don't see this, not even close, anymore. And they were using anticoagulant rodenticides in 4 baiting cycles. That's a lot of bait. They used 5.5 tons of bait, right? And estimated that they killed about 75% of the population. And I'm going to tell you, you need to go a little higher than that, up in the 90s, in order not to have a resurgence of your rat population. But anyway, so they estimated about 75%, and 25% remained to collect ectoparasites. I don't think we would use that strategy today, but that's what they did. Anyway, their results is that they had no cases of murine typhus in people, and actually very interesting, they expanded their rodent control program at the City of New Orleans with the staff. And, we see the benefit and the results of that even today. I would say for most cities, unless you have a university that's in the vicinity working with rodents, rodent-borne diseases are typically poorly studied. And so even a surveillance program that's being funded by the states, there aren't that many either. And so it really often lies at the city level to figure out what that surveillance program is going to be, and how are we going to evaluate what the rodent-borne disease burden is in your area. So we have actually been actively trapping for years. The state of Louisiana in the early 90s had a program to evaluate and do some surveillance on murine typhus, but that funding evaporated long ago. And after Hurricane Katrina, and so that was 2005, so in 2006 we actually began actively trapping, doing rodent necropsies, and it really started in collaboration with a professor at Tulane, and we work through some of the ectoparasite identifications. So we looked at the literature and we found that there was an old world hantavirus in the population of rodents in New Orleans. And so what we wanted to do is basically ask the question, is that virus still in the populations of rodents? And in fact, we ended up trapping 178 rodents, Norway rats in this particular case, and we found that 6 were positive for a sole virus variant. So you can look at the publication for more information on our methodology and our results, but the whole point here is that virus still was circulating. Another cooperative project came along with Tulane University and City of New Orleans, as well as other researchers in Louisiana and in other locations. So the whole goal here of this particular project, it was a large NIH grant. It was awarded in 2013, and it was asking a lot of questions, but it was looking at a post-traumatic urban landscape, which New Orleans was exactly that, since it had just recently endured Hurricane Katrina. And the cool thing about this project is that they were using rats, and in the beginning it was actually Norway rats, but it expanded over time as the sentinel species for this particular project. So they were looking at the distribution and the prevalence of rodent-borne disease, as well as the different population dynamics of rodent species that were in our region. So extensive trapping throughout different regions of New Orleans was completed twice a year. That was summer and winter for 4 years. So we really got a very good picture of where these rodents, and for us what we mostly found were Norway rats and roof rats, with a cotton rat here and there. But for the most part, our city is, the 2 rat species are going to be Norway rats and roof rats. And the red is going to be the Norway rat. The larger the circle, the higher the numbers that were caught in those areas. And blue is the roof rat. So you can see parts of the city on the north side of the city, and it is predominantly roof rats. And in some of our commercial areas, we're finding either a mixture of both, or in some cases, Norway rat is the predominant species. So we've learned a lot. We know that this is very dynamic. Over 2,000 rodents, rats, with a few mice in there as well, were collected over those 4 years. Several pathogens were assayed to determine if they were present in the rodent population. In this particular case, it was Bartonella, and the publication is listed below if you want all the information of this particular study. It was from, the samples were from the same rats that were collected in the study, and it is present throughout the city of New Orleans. And so, of course, the larger the circle, the more prevalent it was, but I am really more interested if it's a yes or no. So if it's red, that means it was found in the sample. So look, if you're working in rodent control, it is absolutely critical that you wear the proper PPE at all times. The prevalence of Leptospira was also analyzed in the tissue samples of the rodents collected. Again, if you'd like to read more about this particular study, please take a look at the publication below. So Leptospira is a bacteria. It can be found in the kidneys, but it's also shed in the urine. So it is very important that you wear closed-toed shoes, and if you are around water and have an opening in your skin, that's a place where that you can have that pathogen enter your body. So again, I'm going to stress to you all, if you're working with rodents, you need to wear the proper PPE. Leptospira is prevalent throughout New Orleans. Sanitation is a key component to rodent management. At a city level, of course, we want our customers, our residents and business owners to follow the code so that their trash is covered and put away properly every time. That's going to remove food availability from these rodents. After a disaster, such as Hurricane Katrina and even Hurricane Ida, trash collection can be interrupted. Well, after Hurricane Katrina, with 80% of the city being flooded, it was months and in some cases years before trash was collected. After Hurricane Ida, New Orleans did not flood, but there was a breakdown in collection of household trash. And so many neighborhoods did not have household trash collected for over a month and a half to 2 months. So of course the concern was all the available food for rodents that may be out in our residential neighborhoods. In many residential and urban areas of cities, you will find abandoned lots. Abandoned lots are incredibly problematic because of high grass, but also because people dump all kinds of things in these lots. So it really does encourage dumping. And ultimately what happens is it is an eyesore, but it also provides the food and the harborage for these pests to survive. And in the study with Tulane, what we found was that these unmaintained properties really became sinks for populations of rodents. Dumpster management is going to be key to rodent management. You can have a facility that is clean inside, even structural openings have been closed, but if the dumpsters look like this in the back of the property, you're sustaining a population of rodents that constantly will be pushing on that facility. We work in cooperation with the Sanitation Rangers as well as the Louisiana Department of Health Environmental Health Specialists. So these are those sanitarians that are going to be able to enter these commercial properties inside and outside. The sanitary code is great and it's well outlined as well as the city codes. But what we needed to do was create some educational materials to really target individual businesses. And so guys, proper dumpster management is rodent prevention. So if you have an account and it looks great inside, but their dumpster is a mess, you're going to need to address it. And we actually made magnets as well as flyers that could be handed out to each individual person. Now again, tomorrow, with the changes in enforcement through our city council, we're also going to be able to issue citations as needed. Exclusion, which is rodent proofing, can be very important in a structure as well as out on the street with garbage cans. So the whole goal here is to prevent rodents from coming in your property, as well as rodents not being able to reach those food sources. So it may be a garbage can that has a lid on it, a tight lid. It may be pet food. Hopefully that's not being stored outside, but some people do store it outside. So make sure it's in a metal container with a lid. Then of course, any kind of property that you've already seen where rodents can move freely underneath doors and different openings on that structure. So at the City of New Orleans, we deal with green spaces, areas along the Mississippi River, private and public owned properties, as well as all city facilities. So we really have a deep reach here across all kinds of properties in Orleans Parish. These photographs were taken about 5 years ago along the Mississippi River before they renovated. And you can see that open garbage cans were, I should say, the normal in that location. And actually they're very common across cities. those open garbage cans, encouraging people to place their trash and debris inside. But ultimately what they become, as I always say, is a feeding trough. So they're full of trash. If they're empty, they smell like trash. There's all kinds of food residues, which will attract rodents to them. And in this particular case, it is no exception. So the picture on the right-hand side, you've got a big burrow system in well-drained soil right outside of a garbage can. So those rats didn't have to work very hard to get their food. This is just another example of an open trash can causing lots of problems. And so that path, that's not a human path, but that's actually a rat run. And so right along the Mississippi River, and again, this photograph is prior to renovation, so all of this has been renovated. And actually what they've done is they've removed the open trash cans to closed garbage cans. And that's made all the difference. So an area that was constantly problematic really has become easy to manage with very few rodent problems, despite the large number of people that pass through that area every day. So in New Orleans, the closed residential garbage cans were introduced in 2007. Now, if you have a closed garbage can, you actually need to leave the lid on it. And so this is something that we do from an educational standpoint. We really do work with our residents and commercial businesses to make sure that if they need a bigger garbage can or add additional garbage cans, please do that instead of leaving the garbage can open and trash exposed. Also, that particular area really should be cleaned, right? So these cans will have a lot of residue on it. So we really encourage people to clean the garbage cans with soap and water on a regular basis. We've continued to make some progress. The RTA, so the folks that own the buses, they actually changed all their open garbage cans to closed cans at the bus and trolley stops. So that's really great. And then in 2015, the City of New Orleans Sanitation Department also began converting cans to closed cans. So from open to closed, that's what we're going for. You can actually see the photograph below. There's I believe that's a big belly, but just on the other side of the corner is an open garbage can. So placement is very important. So it would make a lot more sense to have closed garbage cans together to remove that food source from those rodents. Trapping, as well as the use of rodenticides, are tools that can be used for population reduction of rodents. Trapping can be effective for rodent management, both interior and exterior of a building. We actually use trapping all the time out in parks and other locations throughout the city. But you can see the bottom two pictures, that's actually trapping using pre-baiting of a brand new city facility a few years ago. So in this particular case, they had a brand new building and it had a mouse infestation, pre-baited for about 3 days or so, and that was the result. We actually got quite a few all at one time. We also use different kinds of cage traps, but those are primarily for our purposes for research. We use the cage traps primarily for research purposes. This is typically baited with peanut butter within 2 little pieces of cardboard. We do that because we're able to prepare the little bait wafers in advance, put them in the freezer, have them available whenever we need. But those animals are brought back to our facility. We conduct necropsies following very strict protocol. And we actually gather very important information, the weight, the size, what species, male, female. And then we also take different types of tissue samples that are stored in our -80 freezer for sample analysis. We do use rodenticides in our program. This is a map of New Orleans from 2006 and 7, where at this point after Hurricane Katrina, there was just not very much debris and trash pickup just because of the breakdown in the infrastructure. So what we ended up doing is to really monitor some of our rodent populations, which were increasing. And so we ended up baiting catch basins, in some cases, entire neighborhoods and even zip codes. This figure shows a breakdown of just different consumption rates in parts of the areas that of storm drains that were baited. What we were doing is, of course, we would document how much bait was put into the drains. We always follow the label. You need to read the label, see if the bait can actually, the rodenticide can be used in the storm drains, right? So always check that in advance. But what we did was we actually serviced those every 2 weeks. And so we replenished bait when needed so that we never ran out. And it took about 60 days or so for our populations to start to reduce and pressure basically be relieved in those situations. And what we ultimately saw was a decrease in consumption of the bait in those drains. Homeless encampments are becoming a greater problem in many of urban cities, and New Orleans is no exception. So what we were trying to do is to not really avoid the use of rodenticides in these areas for a couple of reasons. One, because the tamper-proof bait stations were actually being tampered with. People were breaking them, opening them up. So I wanted to make sure that nobody was exposed to rodenticides. You also have to read the label. And in some places, we were more than 100 feet away from a structure, man-made structure, so that also created some issues with the label. We did use a lot of press proofing, which I'm going to talk about, but what was also new is in 2020, we were able to use rat ice. And so that's carbon dioxide that's pelletized. And really, that was a big benefit to managing rodents in these areas, because not only were you killing the rats, but you were also killing the ectoparasites. Don't forget to use pest proofing. In some of our locations, there really was no soil. It was all concrete brick, and many of these were elevated. And so what the rats had basically done is dug out, and they were using that area underneath the concrete for protection, and that's where they were living. So what we ended up doing was simply getting concrete patch, or just mixing it on site, and closing all those openings. So essentially entombing the rat colonies that were inside that area. These areas were checked on a regular basis. What we wanted to do is make sure rodents were kicking or digging out. And really, the city ended up fencing some of these areas. So we were actually quite successful without using any kind of pesticides. So this is just another photograph here, a couple photographs of our staff using rat ice, and it comes in a pelletized formulation. We're using about 2 pounds or so per burrow system, and then once the dry ice is put in, we collapse the mouth of the opening to keep that CO2 gas. The CO2 gas is heavier than air, and it'll sink to the bottom, filling up those burrows. Always use this product according to the label. You need to make sure that you're wearing the right PPE, of course protecting yourself from rodents and rodent pathogens, but as well from the dry ice. You want to make sure that your skin isn't damaged due to the cold temperature. For us, it really has been a game changer to have the ability to kill the ectoparasites at the same time that you're killing the rats. So the concern for me is that when you have rodents in homeless encampments that are living in close proximity to people, we want to make sure that the ectoparasites that potentially have pathogens are killed at the same time, and that they're not jumping onto people. So there's a burrow system, and as I mentioned, carbon dioxide is heavier than air. It'll slowly fill up the bottom of the burrow system and rise to the top as it fills in. Educating our public, our customers, and even public agencies is critical to our success. I will tell you, it is not easy to actually incite behavior change. And so we're coming up with some creative ways here in New Orleans to better understand our public through surveys, and then hopefully target them in a more effective manner. Education across different groups is really important for everyone's success. So this just happens to be the groups of people that I work with. So I work with the residents, right, which could be your customers, but I also work with politicians such as the mayor, city council, and we need to make sure that we're educating those decision makers on best practices and the importance of rodent control. We've got our employees, we've got the general public, the media, news outlets, newspapers, and the industry, and everybody in between. So it can be a very large audience, and of course you're going to be targeting different groups in slightly different manners, but it's important that everyone is involved. Multiple strategies are going to be needed to be effective across your target audiences. And so these are just some examples. Of course, it's always so fun to work with school children, early education. They're very interested, and so that's a lot of fun, but we're going to do that in a certain way. We're also going to work with the pest management professionals. And here, this is really intensive. As you can see, there's all these different microscopes, so we're doing some identifications here. But these folks already have a basic knowledge, so we're just expanding their knowledge. And think about your general population. You may have an elderly group or people that are not as tech savvy. And on the other hand, there are a lot of folks that are on all kinds of social media all day long, so that's a great way of targeting them. And of course, in this particular case, you also need to educate folks that maybe don't want to use any pesticides or are not in agreement with what you do and some of your best practices. So your message is going to be a little bit different, but it's still the fundamental information of rodent control and why it's important to control and kill rodents. So define your brand, right? So what do you stand for? And in our particular case, we're working in public health, and we are improving the lives of our citizens, of our customers. So it's very important. So make sure that your brand is well communicated. And there's lots of different tools that you can use, from websites, social platforms. We've now are really heavy into Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and we're finding that we're getting a lot of good traction actually at putting out basic information. Again, there's direct marketing. QR codes have been, I think, the latest thing. So that's on TV all the time. So utilize them to take that customer to a particular website. So it's just a great opportunity for us. What we also do is advertise learning opportunities, and these are just a few examples. And we're continuing to update the different offerings that we have available based on our target audience and really the observed needs. And so this is just an example that we created a bookmark that is now in our city library. So it's just another audience that we're communicating the basic information of don't feed your pets outside, cover that trash, clean up your trees, right? Your fruit trees, and make sure you close the holes. So it really communicates those basics of IPM strategies so that our public will help participate. But anyway, our social media, using other city platforms, we can reach 100,000 people in just a few tweets. So it's a really strong tool, and what we're finding is people are retweeting. So it's really continuing to get that message across. Make sure your messaging is simple, easy to understand, and just be mindful of your target audience. It's always great to get creative with your educational strategies. So this is something that we launched actually in December. It was Bug the Elf, and she's doing a campaign on pest prevention. So she wanted to let our residents know to make sure to close the windows and put the screens on so pests can't come in, and also not to leave food unattended. There are a lot of opportunities for technical training for our pest management professionals as well as our environmental health specialists. This happens to be at one of our academies, but there are many across the country. And usually they're not too big, typically 30 or so people at a time. And what that does is it helps facilitate partnerships between our public agencies and our private industry. So there's a lot of communication between both, and what we find is that these partnerships often last beyond the training. So it is also an opportunity that we use to train in best practices, right? Our priorities of our particular area. The goal with any education program is to change behavior. So look at this row of dumpsters. This is beautiful, right? Clean, organized, the lids are on. That's what we're looking for. So as you're doing education, of course, I'm doing it at a city level with hundreds of thousands of people, but you can also look at your customers. Draw attention to the topic, show the importance and really the consequences of not doing, or I would say not following best practices. Of course, we want to keep everybody's attention. We all have very short attention spans. Everyone is busy. So continual reinforcement is good. And again, show the importance of it. And what we want to do is change behavior. It's through increased education. And in some cases, if you're in a public agency, it may have to be done through fines and restrictions. But look, the bottom line here is that everyone's going to benefit by following these best practices and following the rules. So I thought I'd show a case study of really integrated pest management at work during the COVID-19 pandemic. Prior to the lockdown in New Orleans, this is what Bourbon Street looked like. Very busy, packed, lots of people all the time. And in fact, we're actually back at this point. So tourism is back in New Orleans, but you can only imagine the amount of food and trash that is being generated. And so on March 11th, 2020, a lockdown was implemented by our mayor and our health director due to this just large number of cases and severe outbreak of COVID that was happening. And so just overnight, the streets became empty. No more food being generated, less trash being generated, and I'm going to show you what happened. Well, it didn't take long for hungry rats to come out looking for food. And so these animals that were perhaps in the shops and wherever it was behind the doors were coming out looking for food because it was gone. And so we took a proactive approach with the situation to really educate the public on what was happening, what could they do, what could businesses do. By this time, almost everything was shut down. People were at home. In the state of Louisiana, our pest management professionals, vector control, were considered essential workers. And so we did not miss one day. We continued on and really took this opportunity to implement some very aggressive treatments. Early on in the pandemic, when things were shut down, we were working with the mayor to get the message out of how important our rodent control program is and the role of our pest control community. That we needed our customers to continue with service, especially because we were seeing rodents out in the street looking for food. So she really did give a shout out to our industry, which I think is super important, and that was really done through social media. And she also made mentions in press conferences as well as press releases. So we took this opportunity when a lot of restaurants were shut down, people were at home, and the rats were under extreme stress because of the lack of food. We really took that opportunity, along with our pest management professional partners, to really do aggressive treatments and abatement in many of our commercial areas. I hope, frankly, that I never have this opportunity again, right? And so it was, really important for us to do as much as we could at that time. So we took a multi-pronged approach once we had the opportunity, of course, because businesses were closed, people were at home, and so we really were able to move freely in lots of areas that were in the past pretty congested. So we had to do treatments right away. And so we were putting out bait, rodenticides, and we were actually measuring consumption. So both of actual rodenticides and some non-toxicant bait to determine what areas were active. So really based on consumption. So all that data was recorded And we've been able to look at the situation over the course of time. Also using electronic monitoring devices for establishment of rodent surveillance, right? So really playing around with these new devices so that it would record activity for us. And our plan here is to be expanding throughout New Orleans, and I'm going to be talking about that here in some slides. We also were trapping rodents, live rodents, and doing the necropsies at our office, collecting tissue samples. We were also collecting the ectoparasites for evaluation down the road of pathogens. And look, cooperation is key. So of course I'm at a city, but you are mostly in businesses, right? So it's important for agencies, public and private industry to work together. It may be data sharing, it may be enforcement. You know, unfortunately here in New Orleans, we've got an excellent working relationship with our industry. And so I often will get a phone call saying, look, I'm working at in this area, we're seeing X, Y, and Z. What can you guys do from the street side of things, right? Or can you help address that dumpster or that open garbage can? So there's a lot of cooperation that goes amongst agencies. And then of course, you know, we've talked a little bit already about public education for our residents. And so very important. And if that might even be a business owner talking about pest proofing, look, those rodents were coming out from underneath doors and openings. So we definitely have to improve pest proofing along some of those commercial corridors. And while doing all of this is ensuring the safety of our employees. And so especially when this started, there weren't any vaccines, a lot of unknowns with COVID. And so needed to keep our workforce safe at all times. So this photograph shows that rodents were definitely utilizing our storm drains. So in New Orleans, the sanitary sewers and the storm drains, so rainwater, are separate. Every drop of rainwater ends up in Lake Pontchartrain. It's getting, you know, pushed out through pumps. But again, the sanitary sewer is separate. So we have done in the past, especially after Hurricane Katrina, we did zip codes, large areas of storm drain baiting with great success. But in this case, we just didn't, you know, get a lot of acceptance. So we had to change strategies. And so experience counts here. So, you know, we had done it before, great success, but not the case. What's plan B? And what we found at really inspecting the situation is that many of these properties had structural openings. I mean, you can see I'm pointing to the arrow. We even caught a rodent coming out from underneath the door. It is so important that businesses and properties do proper pest proofing, a door sweep, fixing that concrete so that it's level. All those things are important. And so there they were. And so the option that we decided to go with was to actually set up bait stations along the sidewalks. And this is in the French Quarter. You can see that from the construction, but we went ahead, documented all the locations, measured consumption bait, made sure that we had the proper amount in the bait stations per placement. You got to read that label because it does vary. And what you don't want to do is not place enough. You know, you want to make sure that there's enough there for those rodents, and your frequency of inspections is very important so that you just don't run out. And when inspecting these properties, don't forget about the naturally occurring, you know, seeds and nuts that might be out there. This happens to be a situation where those palm trees were all full of fruit that were falling on the ground. You can actually see some of the nibbles from some rodents on some of that fruit. That vegetation needed to be cut down, which it was, and ideally, if you do have one of these types of plants on your property, cut out the fruiting bodies before it actually puts out fruit. You can actually see there's a pigeon down there as well. So really important, we want to remove all that food source for those rodents. This happens to be the French market, and we worked with the French market in a very intense way. So they really needed to do some structural repairs, which without customers, that's exactly what they did. So This is an area, unfortunately, that we would see rodents on a pretty regular basis, despite some aggressive rodent control practices by our group. But with working with them, they really cleaned everything up. The shop owners took time to also make repairs. And those structural repairs were critical because they were, in some cases, harborage locations for rodents that were nesting. So all of that is now gone. So we're using the ActiveSense system by Corteva Agri-Sciences. And many of you may have seen the system before using it at an individual property. But what we're trying to do is have hubs installed across the city of New Orleans that communicate. So the stations that are being installed around New Orleans will be able to communicate through the hub and give us the data that we need electronically. It is definitely quite a process to get these installed. We have to find really high points in the city. And in this particular case, it's a building, it's the old VA building that has 10 stories. So there's our city electrician installing it, hardwiring it into their system, and we were able to get pretty good communication. It's really been a learning experience, and so the top is just a map, a modeling map of where that hub could communicate. So the darker the area, less communication. But here it is, we've got some stations that were installed, we're putting in the sensors, hooking it up to the network, and then we need to make sure that it is reliably communicating. We have since established 40 locations, and typically city facilities. It could be a fire station or a police station, something that is a bit ubiquitous with the neighborhood, so it's very representative. That site would be representative of that neighborhood. And each site would have 6 stations. So we've been trapping through the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're going to be continuing that into 2022. We're looking at population density, as well as collecting the samples for evaluation of pathogens. What's been really exciting is that we've been forging new relationships with some of our university partners, as well as getting our facility up to BSL2+, so that we can analyze the samples internally. We have a full molecular biology laboratory with the equipment that's needed, and we've got the staff that can do the work. Surveys are a great way to understand your target audience. And so if you're a business, you can create a survey. So just as an easy example, there's Outlook 365. There's an app that has a form, and you can create easy questions, short little surveys that you can send out to your customers through email lists or even social media for you to better understand their needs. How do they think your service may be? We do that as well. So it's a very good quantitative tool, and it lets us understand the target audience preferences and really what they know and what they don't know. And so we really want to understand what's going to motivate, right, our target audience, as well as preventing them from, let's say, dumping or stacking tires in their yard. Different things are going to cause issues. This can be done in print, electronic, or even in person. And as I mentioned, there are lots of programs, SurveyMonkey, Qualtrics, Forms. There's lots of different options for you to use, and I would really encourage you to do so. You can really learn a lot. So I'm going to give you an example of a very good case study around waste tires. And so what we found was that our residents really had no idea that the city would actually pick up waste tires from their residents. And so I'm going to show you the story. So what we did was we asked the residents if they had tires, yes or no, and some did, and if they've ever discarded them on their lot, on their property. We also asked them where they see tires, and there was a whole series of questions, right? But the one that I really want to focus on is, did you know that the city will pick up 4 tires placed next to a garbage can from properties eligible for garbage collection? Holy cow! The respondents said, no, we do not know. 71% said had no idea. So what we ended up doing is using social media to create very specific educational materials that focused around tire pickup. It was all about educating those consumers. We did it in collaboration with the sanitation department. So we're going to be doing this with rodents. We've got a bunch of different questions and trying to understand what is going to motivate the residents not to place bird food out, not to leave, pet food out. And I suspect that many folks are not putting two and two together and understand that if you leave pet food out, you're going to have rodents and other wildlife visiting. So we'll have a better idea here in about 6 to 8 months. Thank you for your time today. And again, if you'd like to follow us on social media, we're at NOLA Mosquito. And to join our email list for educational opportunities, please email education@nola.gov and we'll put you on our mailing list. Thank you again and have a great day.